in Christ today. And therefore we called it the power of poetic storytelling, because we think our storytelling, that is the way we speak, teach, write, should be more poetic, artistic, and creative. And that is because the culture around us is more attuned to those ways, and because the gospel is such as well. We're going to go through 4 points. I'm going to do the first 2. First, we're going to look at the current religious landscape. Then we're going to go back to the Gospels to look at the way Jesus spoke and what speaking in parables might mean for our way of speaking. And then Jay will take over and describe poetic language and show how we can apply it today. Current religious landscape. I'm going to begin with G.K. Chesterton and his take on why we travel when we travel. In a short story called The Riddle of the Ivy, a friend visits Chesterton and sees him packing a luggage. So he's wondering what Chesterton is up to and asks him what he's doing. And Chesterton says, I'm going to travel through Paris, Belfort, Heidelberg, and Frankfurt with the aim of finding what? What do you think that Chesterton was hoping to find in France and Germany? Those who don't know the story, any suggestions? Himself. Heather?
Himself.
Mm-hmm.
A wife?
A wife? Good, yep. Good option. You're already looking at it creatively. Excellent. Yes?
The perfect church.
The perfect church. Okay. Yes? Anything else?
Adventure.
Adventure.
Meaning, purpose.
Meaning, purpose. Okay, let's see what his answer is. He says, I shall enjoy both France and Germany, but it is not them that I'm seeking. I'm seeking Battersea. That is his hometown where he was. The whole object of travel is not to set foot on foreign land. It is, at last, to set foot on one's own country as a foreign land. He was hoping to travel in other countries so that he can get a better perspective about the place where he resided and to see it, as we could say, for the first time. And this is what we're going to do in the first part here. I'm going to take you on a quick tour through Europe. I have 2 postcards, so to say, from Europe. First is a postcard from post-Christian Europe. Europe is considered a very secular continent, especially if it is connected or compared to Americas, Africa, or Asia. And out of Europe, there are a few regions or countries that are considered the most secular. The Czech Republic, Estonia, and the region of former East Germany are considered the most secular. I come from the Czech Republic. So I come from that secular region, most atheist region. And we can see this decline of interest in religion in several numbers. One, national censuses show us that there is a decline in religious affiliation. In 1991, 44% people in the Czech Republic declared that they belong to a religion. It was after 40 years of communism that tried to suppress religion. But that declined to about 22 in 2021. So it's a steep decline in the Czech Republic. Olomouc is one city in the Czech Republic. There's a university, there are sociologists of religion, and they looked at these numbers more closely. So from their research, they think that it's better actually to divide people into 4 groups today. First, those who participate in a religion, those who consider themselves part of a mosque or a church. That number, from their research, was only slightly higher than 9%. In the Czech Republic. Much bigger group, but still not very big, is 20% of those who say, I believe in God, or I believe in a supernatural power above us, but I am not part of any religion. This is just my private conviction. 20%. Almost 56% in the Czech Republic are non-believers. Those who say, I do not believe there is any God. And then almost 15% of atheists, those who believe there is no God. So these numbers are much more sombering. No wonder then The Guardian in 2018, in a large article on religion in Europe, declared Czechia, or Czech Republic, is the most atheist country in Europe. if these were the numbers, what shall we do? Maybe one option is to follow our brothers and sisters in Netherlands who turned their Roman Catholic Church into a skate park. There's no space for religion in Europe anymore. But that's just a postcard from post-Christian Europe. Then there's also a postcard from post-secular Europe, I think. The same group of researchers from Olomouc University asked more pointed questions to all those groups about their beliefs and also about their practices. They followed a traditional matrix of dividing people according to different religions. So they didn't try to ask kind of non-traditional questions. But even with that, they got very non-traditional, unique answers. For example, they learned that both participants in the religion and those who simply believed in something about them considered their belief very significant for the way they coped with life's difficulties and crises, for religious coping. Even those who did not step into a church or a mosque, those said, what I believe is helping me to go through difficult things in life. Even more shockingly, they learned that non-believers and atheists, much bigger group in the Czech Republic, they practice traditional spiritual disciplines, such as fasting, silence, solitude, meditation, even prayer, and place or consider spirituality to be very important for their lives, even though they do not believe in God. But spiritual practices were important for them. So those people have zero orthodox beliefs from a Christian point of view. But they regularly practice many orthodox spiritual disciplines. Finally, I put here a picture of a book that was considered by, or called by literary critics in the Czech Republic in 2022, the best book published in 2022, and it became a bestseller in 2022 and 2023. It is written by Kateřina Tučková, it's called Wine Water, and it's a 700-page novel based on historical reconstructions. It presents a fictional story about one Catholic order of nuns and their battle with communist oppression and contemporary misunderstandings. These women, there are several women portrayed in that story, nuns, who devoted their life to Christ, and they were able to stand for truth and compassion because their lives were changed by the gospel. This is the bestseller. I have not read a more powerful and moving book in a long time about characters whose lives are changed by Jesus. This is a 700-page long book written by a young lady who do not profess to be a Christian, and it is a bestseller in my home country. So surely there's something post-secular in Europe as well. If I put these things together, and I'm following these sociologists of religion, those names are not important for you, but I just want to cite them because that's a good work that they're doing. We could say that Czech atheists are really not atheists at all. The picture is much more complicated in the most secular country in Europe or in the world. But there's a low level of trust in institutions, religious institutions. So I'm basically repeating what we heard last night, those who were here. Also, low level of commitment to an institution. Belief is much more private, individualized in the Czech Republic. Like we heard last night, faith is self-made in our context as well. There is, however, deep interest in spirituality, and even beyond that, in the religion as it should be. Good example is that book, because that book tries to explore what one order of nuns faithfully lived in a religion that values women in the position of authority. Saying, the book is trying to make the comment, this is how Christianity could look like if you pay attention to these pockets that are out there, even in the Czech Republic. Just pay attention to that. And I think what we are experiencing in Europe, therefore, is interest in depth. Christianity needs to offer deep answers, not even answers, deep insights. And what we are experiencing, I think, is a sign of what British sociologist in 1950s, Chris Davies, said. It's about believing without belonging. I think that we live in a similar context. I prepared something different here, but after what we learned from Mark Matlock last night, for those who were not here, or even those who were here, I'm just going to repeat a few things. He divided people into 4 different groups: naturalists, rigid believers, curious skeptics, spiritually curious. Those who are in our churches often are fragile believers, according to Mark. They have closed mindset sometimes, but they're interested in the supernatural. There are many people out there who have open mindset and who are interested in the supernatural. Many Christians today, he said, do not know about faith, that his data showed. But there is a deep interest in spirituality and religion, but faith is self-made. I am making my own set of beliefs, and we do need to pay attention to that. So he suggested that we need to approach these explorers by asking questions of discovery. And then later he closed with these principles. Listen without judgment, do not force a conclusion, let them make their own conclusion. And then leads me to step towards poetic storytelling. But before I go there, I'll see if you have any questions just on this topic of our religious landscape. Just to go back to Chesterton, I would say, through this quick tour through Europe, I think we can see that our culture is not maybe as pronounced as the one that I described in the Czech Republic, but the trend is going there as well. Priscilla?
Is the book that you mentioned written, translated in English?
Yeah, it is not yet, but it will be. I bet it will be.
Was a huge kickback against belonging to an institution or another group of a faith group.
Is your question asking, is there kickback in other religions, not only in Christianity? Are you
I
saying?
think
No.
just in general, over because you were sharing percentages about people who have spiritual beliefs, but you said that is something they have come up themselves. We create our own spirituality, and we do not want to belong to an institution or a faith group.
Especially, I don't want to belong in the institution that seems to be living against what I consider God wants us to do or live. So and we all have problems with that. Sure. Thank you, Kevin. Yes, Jeremy?
Given the long history of the Czech Republic and its experience under communism, did that contribute to the skepticism of the institution?
Yes and no. Because this is not the case in other post-communist countries. Poland is significantly different, and we share northern border with Poland. So there's something going on that is very different in the Czech Republic and in Estonia, and they have other reasons. I did communicate with some scholars from Estonia on that. In the Czech Republic, it seems to be that the reason is a long memory of oppression and misrepresentation of the gospel and religious violence in the country. So all these things that we are doing now, living in the polarized age, will have effect on generations to come. Richard?
I heard a sociologist recently talk about in America, the contemporary generation, Generation Z, and the high degree of depression and suicide connected to the lack of institutional belonging in religion. And I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
I think that belonging is very important as well, and for these people, but probably slightly differently, on the level of inner, on a level of relationships rather than on a level of membership, on a level of having a community that cares for me rather than a community that states something. So, but those are just a few things that.
And I wonder if American individualism leads to a greater depression and suicide in the US than in certain European countries.
Wow, that is a good question, but I don't know the answer. So I'm going to move forward. We'll see if you have more questions. It will be at the end. There will be a space to say. to ask them. I think that we can go back to Jesus, if this is true about religious landscape, that is more amorphous, that those who are in the church are maybe weak in terms of their beliefs. Those who are outside are strong in their hunger. Maybe Jesus can teach us something through the way he primarily spoke. And I chose parables. In the 4th chapter of his gospel, Mark puts together a set of parables that he prefaces with a story that I think should be taken as an introduction to understanding why he used those parables. That introduction, that is in Mark 3, 31 to 34, 35, depicts a situation when Jesus teaches in a house. When he teaches in the house, he is visited by his mother and his brothers who stand outside. And they tell him, your mother and brothers are standing outside. And he says, who's my mother or my brothers? And then he looks at those who listen to him and says, here's my mother, here's my brothers. I think that this is an introduction into the parables. Those who are closest to Jesus, that is his physical family, or later on those who claim to be Christians, might be actually on the outside, while the insiders are unexpected individuals who hear his word, that's what he says, and do what it says. And I would add hear, understand, and do. The parables then are a chosen means to address both the insiders and the outsiders, so that those who hear, understand, and do God's will would be those who fit into the kingdom. Because those parables are parables about the kingdom. So the chosen means how to elicit interest are the parables. Jesus then, in the parables, did not present a quick lesson about 3 points where everything is explained to you and it's all done for you and you just write it down and it's done. No, because the message that he presented is, as he says here, is a secret. It's a secret that you need to discover on your own, that you need to seek. And he even uses text from Isaiah 6:9. You may indeed listen but not understand, and you might not turn away. So this is a greatest preacher of all times who says, well, I'm preaching to you so you would not understand. But because there is something in it. If we when people, those who are interested, hear that, well, I want to discover that. What is that key? What is it about? And interestingly, at the end, in Mark 4:34, and that's a concluding section of this set of parables, the evangelist tells us he did not speak to them except in parables. So, from the perspective of Mark, everything that Jesus said was a parable. Not only the parables themselves, but everything else. I don't know if you have any maybe suggestion what else could be just like a parable. It could seem simple, but there's something deep in it. Maybe you have some suggestions. What else would Jesus? Yes, Melody.
When Jesus said that unless you eat of my body, you cannot be a part of me.
Great. Yeah. How shall we understand it? What is it? Anything else? I think that this quick exposure into parables, I don't have more time to speak about it, can tell us something how we can speak today. In our post-Christian and post-secular context, I think we're in both. It is harder to know who is in and who is out. Sometimes those who are out are actually really in, and those who are in our churches are out. So this could be a helpful way how we can offer the good news about Jesus to them so that it can become clear who hears, understands, and does. Parables are like riddles. They are open-ended. And here I'm saying basically the same thing that Mark said last night. open-ended way of speaking. They also need the listeners to be deciphered. They are not just given lessons and people are, sitting and taking notes. No. The audience, if it is like a riddle, without them the riddle falls flat. It doesn't work. That entice curiosity, and they value the listeners. And that's what we heard even this morning. That's what the new generation needs. And I think that's what the gospel actually is about, the image of God in all of us. Valued those who listen. They are participants. So how can we rediscover a more open-ended and poetic way of storytelling? And with that, I'm passing on to Jay.
Thanks, Joseph. I thought of like 4 or 5 things to say, and then as soon as he just said my name, I forgot them all. So, segue. Over the last couple of years, like in 2018 and 2019, I went to Chicago and tried to teach educators how to teach poetry. So as part of the Poetry Foundation, they asked me to come and do a talk on, well, how do you teach poetry to young people? Or how do you teach poetry to educators? The fact that you are all here is living proof that there might have been an English teacher somewhere in the world that didn't turn you off from poetry entirely. So thank you. Thank you for those people, right? As we get going today, I just want to talk to you about understanding poetic language. And I just want to extend this into your imagination for what that looks like. For example, like, that if you open up your Bible to the center, you're in Psalms, right? And you look at that and you say, that's a poem. I'm telling you that your Bible is 50% poetry, at least, okay? If not more. And Joseph was talking about how parables are kind of prosaic poems. And as we're thinking today, I'm encouraging you, whatever your ministry looks like, whatever you do, whether it's preaching or writing or just talking with people, use poetry because it's a way to capture their attention and it's a way to build intentional connection between people. So how do we do that? I want to start by just explaining that teaching poetry or thinking about poetry, it requires a flip-flop inversion of the way we do anything. Because from the very, very beginning of time, when you start learning about writing, you learn that you're supposed to have a main point and that you're supposed to fledge it out with details. This kind of idea came from a book called The Triggering Town by Richard Hugo. He's an academic and a poet. Hugo says poems work in just the opposite fashion. In fact, they're all details and they come to a point. Have you ever heard like a really, really good story that kind of comes full center and it stops and you're right there and you hear it and you feel it? That's what poems do, right? Poems are not the opposite. So this is like your classic news story, right? Who won the Super Bowl? You find out from the very beginning and then you get the details out of that, right? So when you want to rework the way you communicate or the way you try to talk to people, you have to recognize that it's a full inversion. And if you think that this is new, I would just say this is the way Jesus speaks. He speaks in a flip-flop mode. He speaks through inversion. And the details are always his path to find the point that he wants to make. So it is a different way of reading. It is a different way of thinking and communicating. And it starts with Jesus. So we're talking books today. I didn't realize we're going to just drop books all day long, but I want to give you a couple, right? The Caged Owl by Gregory Orr, okay? A book that will, if you don't like poetry, I swear, it'll be the book that brings you into poetry. Greg Orr is an educator. He's also an academic at the University of Virginia. And in about 1998, he penned this kind of thing called the 4 Temperaments. Basically, it's a way to understand poetry if you don't understand poetry. And the way that he described it is, poetry is push-pull. It is yin and yang. And you need things that ground the story, but you also know that anytime you've heard a really great poem, it's like lifting up, right? Like you feel like a fuller version of yourself. The same with music, right? Like that guy over there, Chris Hopper, right? Maybe when you hear one of his songs, right? You feel lifted up. And I would just say that's what poetry is. It's that tension in between those two impulses. And so For Greg Orr, he calls these temperaments as a way to kind of understand how poetry works. There's limiting impulses and there's flight. And you need them both to kind of understand how poetry works. So just, I know you can read them, but in case it's a little hard from the back, story, structure, those are the grounding elements. And then imagination and musicality are your elements of flight. And for Orr, the idea is that all of us have a natural predisposition to one of these kind of features in the way we think about storytelling. Some of us are real story-driven. Do you know the person in your church who is uber creative, but if you ask them to just go left and then go right, they get lost, right? We all have these different kind of doorways that we can walk through, and we have other ones that are harder. So for Orr, the idea is learn about them all, and then find a skeleton key that opens all of them. And that's really kind of what we're trying to talk about today. Just like when I was a student at Northeastern, we celebrated and we worshiped in different styles, different worship styles. I grew up in like a very small Lutheran church where we were like worshiping like this with our hands down, and we would sing through our liturgy. I didn't grow up in a charismatic church. Can you imagine if I did, right? Wouldn't my view of how I would worship be different? Would my view be a little different? Well, I'm saying that for all of us, we probably have a different key that helps us to kind of open how we try to understand poems, right? But if all you are is musicality, and you try to open it for a lock, that story, you're gonna get kind of flushed out of the poem. This is why people tend to hate poetry, right? Because it's not opening for me. The puzzle won't reveal itself, okay? I don't have enough patience to sit here and do your 500-piece jigsaw puzzle, right? That's how we feel sometimes. But what I want to suggest is that really, when you start reading poems, you can read from the thing that is most natural and the thing that is most true for you, and you can strengthen those other areas so that you, as a reader, now you are infinitely capable of doing things that you never thought you could do before. And as a communicator, you're not pigeonholed into one modus operandi of trying to communicate. And so let me just pull out of this for 1 second and just talk to you about these elements for the sake of clarifying. So story, which you understand is narrative kind of storytelling, which in our Bibles is a tried and true method that you'll see in a lot of books, right? By structure, I mean the setup of it. Anybody remember what a haiku is from a long, long time ago? You know that it's always 575, right? Yeah, you got it, right? So you know the structure, the way it's set up. A lot of types of stories or a lot of type of literature have a structure in it, right? Things are going to get worse before they get better, right? That's understanding how structure works in a piece of literature. I think you know what imagination is, right? Something that reshapes the way you look at something. It's tropes, it's metaphors, it's ways of trying to elicit a higher or a new way to see a thing. Musicality is sometimes where we get tripped up a little bit. So I just wanted to show you what I think Orr means in the way I teach musicality to my students when we think about poetry. And it means how you feel inside. So you don't have to be able to play guitar like Louis Cologne or Chris Hopper, right? What you need to be able to do is feel deep in your soul what the music is doing. And if you can do that, you are at the very crux of understanding musicality. So let me play this instrumental track for you for about 20 seconds. And I just want you to name any emotions that you hear. And they will be varied. We won't all hear the same thing. What do you hear? If you're reading the soundtrack, that's dropped in. Suspense. That's great. That's a good start. What else do you hear, though? 'Cause that's not the only thing, right?
Uncertainty.
uncertainty,
Anticipation.
bleakness,
Gotcha.
tension. Okay, what else?
Nostalgia of being stuck.
Nostalgia of being stuck, okay?
Anxiety.
Anxiety.
That's what I was gonna say, but I'm too affected by his eyes.
There you go. Maybe that's why you feel anxious, right? Being spied upon. Okay? But you hear all those different things, right? And that's because you can pluck out, maybe if you didn't think of that certain word, you can still kind of say, yeah, I can see that, right? If you can do that, it's because of the musicality that you hear in it. And then it is, quite frankly, our best form of communicating across all ages, across all different backgrounds. It's something that we understand because it's human. So musicality is the way we feel, right? I wrote a lot of poems to this song, like a lot, like probably like 30, listening to it over and over again. Sometimes when I would listen to the song over and over again and I was writing at my desk, my wife would walk into the room, she'd hear me listening to it, she'd just walk right out. Leave him alone, okay? He's doing his thing, right? So as we're working to kind of understand how to use this kind of tool to understand how we can think about poetry and how we can implement it in our own work, you have to start to think about where you might be strongest naturally. So I want to read a poem to you, and I think you all have it on the handout that we gave you. This is a poem by a poet called Liang Li, who's Chinese American. If you want to know like bios, right? His father was the personal physician for Mao Zedong. His mother and Lai and his siblings fled China when they were young. I think he was about 6 or 7 years old, and they relocated in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He actually had a brief stint at SUNY Brockport. But in his later, when Lee's father came to America, he became a Presbyterian minister. So if you want to think about like different courses of careers, right? So this is a poem that I want to read to you. And after we read it, I want you to kind of see how, this is just my suggestion, of how these different temperaments are being enacted. Now for Orr, you don't have to be a one-trick pony. You can be a poet that encompasses all of these tools. That's when you're in masterclass territory, right? When you can combine them all simultaneously in one text, that's what I'm calling that teal section, right? These last couple lines here. So I want to read this for you once, and then I'm going to read it again, and then we're going to talk just through it quickly before we get into a parable, and we try to apply some of the same kind of strategies. So I asked my mother to sing. She begins, and my grandmother joins her. Mother and daughter sing like young girls. And if my father were alive, he would play his accordion and sway like a boat. I've never been in Peking or the Summer Palace, nor stood on the great stone boat to watch the rain begin on Kunming Lake, the picnickers running away in the grass. But I love to hear it sung, how the water lilies fill with rain until they overturn, spilling water into water, and then rock back and fill with more. Both women have begun to cry, but neither stops her song. What type of poem is this? You didn't know you were going to be quizzed. 14 lines. Anybody got it? Yes. It is a sonnet, okay? It's a sonnet. And this is the first component that I want you to know. It's structured. Every sonnet throughout all time was supposed to be sung. I can't sing, so that's the best I could do, right? Just trying to read it that way. But all sonnets were lyrical. They were supposed to be sung. And what you need to know is there's always a turning point. There's a twist. It's called the volta. And the volta is in line 9. So you see the first 8 lines, that's the octave. And you see the last 6 line, that's the sestet. There's always a turn. And so anytime you're looking at a sonnet and you're reading the problem in the first octave, you know there's supposed to be some movement into solution, right? That's anticipatory, right? That's the way that structure is kind of built into this. We also have a little bit of a situation here, right? From the very 2 lines, the poet doesn't even join the poem, right? It's just vantage point of how other family members are dealing with a current situation. And what you can see, I think, from the story is in that green section where you realize what the conflict is, okay? And you can see that the father is no longer with them. But he is with them in another way, right? His personality, his presence, it looms large into this particular family. Now, this is the part I love to read with students because they just ask me, like, who are these picnickers? What are these places? I've never been to Quinming Lake. How am I supposed to picture this? I'm not Chinese. And I would tell them, you don't have to be. This is imagination. Because what we have to start to realize is happening now, you know from that beige section that the women are singing, right? So what is that pink section? What they're singing about. It's what they're singing about, right? It's the folk song. It's the lyrics that the women are singing about. I don't know why it makes them weepy. I don't know why it makes them feel connected to him. But why would you do that? Why would you sing a song that you knew was going to make you boo-hoo cry when usually we don't like to do that kind of stuff? Because someone is that loved, right? And so the imagination pulls us into that moment where these women are singing. And he can hear his father's kind of voice in their singing. He can hear the accordion. If that really throws you off because you just don't know anything about accordions, just slip guitar in there, okay? And just think it through. That switch is the musicality, right? In that little blue or purplish section there, don't you start to feel things, right? From these women's perspectives? But I love to feel it, I love to hear it sung. How the water lilies fill with rain until they overturn. What's happening now? These are images that are coming from the song, but what else is happening? They're also images that display the story. It's the women themselves. So by the time we come to this last stanza, this couplet at the end, the poem is on fire, right? The poem is on fire in such a way where every single temperament is firing. You have story, you have structure, you have imagination, you have the other one that I am not saying right now, but they're all here. And if I read it one more time for you, I just invite you to kind of see how all the pieces work together in cohesion. She begins and my grandmother joins her. Mother and daughter sing like young girls. And if my father were alive, he would play his accordion and sway like a boat. I've never been in Peking or the Summer Palace, nor stood on the great stone boat to watch the rain begin on Quinming Lake, the picnickers running away in the grass. But I love to hear it sung, and how the water lilies fill with rain until they overturn, spilling water into water, and then they rock back and fill with more. Both women have begun to cry, but neither stops her song. And that, friends, is the power of poetic storytelling unleashed, right? But I'm not here to tell you that Liang Li is the only one to ever do this. In fact, it's laced throughout the Gospels that I can read. And in fact, there's parables everywhere. One book that I read for a class with Dr. Gerhardt was a book about the Gospel and how when the author was Bruce Chilton. It was called For the Kingdom of Heaven. I can check that for you if you're really curious about that. But one of the metaphors that I love from that book is how Jesus was a storyteller paramount, and he would walk around and at any time necessary be able to kind of pull out the perfect story and say, I got this. And he's going to let it go, and he's going to connect, and he's going to tell the story. That's why maybe in your Gospels you see kind of similar versions of some stories kind of popping up, right? But I love the idea that he has this quiver of stories that are going to be appropriate at any particular time. So we put this text on the handout for you as well, right? The parable of the rich fool. And we wanted you to have a chance to kind of look at this text with new eyes. And we wanted you to kind of look at it and have a chance to see which temperament do you think is present in this text. Which one is speaking out most forcefully to you? Okay? So I'm going to read that for us, and you can look on the copy just in front of you. But remember, we're looking for story. We're looking for structure. We're looking for imagination. or musicality. So you could think about any of those. How does it make you feel? What kind of ideas do you see that are interesting? How does the structure shape it? What is the story? Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be the judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to him, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich toward God." And you can see Joseph and I projected how this might look for us, but this is only one variation. I'm sure you could have it color-coded in a different way, and that's fine. All of those readings are valid. But do you see any of these temperaments manifesting in this text? You see story, structure, imagination, musicality? Yeah.
Questions I have about musicality is things can be in a major note or a minor discordance, musicality. So for example, I work in a farming community where that's how you farm. You make bigger barns over time and store more and more. This parable is going to rub them the wrong way, but maybe that's the point. Can you say more about that? I'm trying to figure out how I might use it somehow.
Yeah, I think so. I think like most of his stories are coming straight back to the people, right?
Right.
He's telling them stories. They're an agrarian society. He understands that, and that's why he's talking about mustard seeds. That's why he's talking about farming kind of principles. I would just say with this is that it's not targeting their profession. It's targeting their hearts, right? The way that they think about what's theirs and what's everybody else's. And all the labor that's behind what's theirs and what's everybody else's, right? It's not vocational, it's relational. Right? So as we kind of flip through toward how to apply this, I'm going to do it super quickly because that's where my time is. I'm giving you 2 guidelines on poetic storytelling. The first is in your own storytelling or in your own preaching, you need to apply metaphors. I'm asking you to think about your way of communicating this being a 2-pronged explosion of words. Some are going to be ideas, and some are going to be objects. There's a poet that I love so much, his name is Tony Hoagland. He made up this word called thingitude, right? Which I just think is the most awesome way to describe what poetry should be. Okay? Basically, I can boil it down like this. Yes, you should use metaphors. Yes, they are both universal, and they have what I call the local image, where they have a private meaning to each person. But just like when we read our scripture, we read our gospel reading, we're banking that some of those metaphors mean the same thing to us and that we can understand things together. The thing that we don't usually do well is bring images or objects into our storytelling. And I'm just telling you that objects have all the power. If you're writing a poem and you're Gregory Orr, Greg Orr had a horrible hunting experience when he was 12 years old where he was carrying a shotgun. He was hunting with his brothers and his father. He tripped, he shot, and he killed his brother. Every time I read those poems with my students, even the ones that protest to hate poetry, when they read 3 poems back to back to back, one called Self-Portrait at 20, they know exactly where he feels because many of them have some of those same kind of feelings. 2, when they read a poem called Litany, And it's from the perspective right afterwards. It's this boy running to his room. It's this boy crying his eyes out, putting his knuckles into his eyes. It's this boy being afraid and feeling guilty of eating soup. The last image, he's eating alphabet soup. That's poetry. That's power, right? You need thingitude in your storytelling. You need it to be able to convey the message. You need it because that's where the power is. If you aren't putting things into your sermons, if you aren't putting objects that hold meaning to you, you can't share that with anybody else. You can only get so far with ideas. You can only get so far with the scripture even. You've got to bring the object that focuses our attention. You've got to bring that object that is going to allow students to feel the charge of the language. And so, with thingitudes, just to summarize quickly here, there's power in poetics. One thing that Hoagland wrote is that there's two well-known descriptions or ways of thinking about poems. One is by Henry Wadsworth, and the other is by Wallace Stevens. The first type of poet says that poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. I call that just emotions, okay? Second poet tried to be all intellect, okay? No, I'm not going to tell you anything about me. I'm going to be purely intellectual about my poetry, and I'm going to write things that no 10th grader will ever understand, okay? Like The Snowman, right? Really hard poem. But as you look at this, what I would say is really good poetry is probably a merger of those two types. Even though kids are largely fed that poetry is one or the other. It's A or B. It's not. It's C. It's the one that isn't up on the board, right? So show them what poetry can do, because they are listening to music that is hip hop. They are listening to music that Taylor Swift is writing. These are the poets of their age, okay? Leave them alone. Let them have poetry and find a way to connect it with the scriptures that are doing the same thing, okay? Don't judge, right? I had U2. U2 was doing the same thing that Taylor Swift or whoever else today is doing, right? They're taking old stories, they're finding new ways to bring the current situation, and they're using poetry as the vehicle to get people together. And if you don't know that it's poetry, then you're missing out. The last quote that we have here for our slides comes from Eugene Peterson. In his talk from On Being with Krista Tippett, this is what he writes about understanding metaphors. All the prophets were poets. And if you don't know that, you try to literalize everything and make shambles out of it. A metaphor is a really remarkable kind of formation because it both means what it says and what it doesn't say. And so those two things come together and it creates an imagination which is active. You're not trying to figure things out, you're trying to enter into what's there. So my prayer for you is that you find new ways to engage metaphor and thingitude in your own work, and that you find new ways to share the good news with others. Amen.
Thank you so much for that. That was great. Do you know you can download these slides? You can. You go to the Rebuild Live, website, nes.edu. Same place where you do the survey, which we'll do before you leave here. There's a link to a Google Docs thing, and the slides are all available for, I think, most of all the workshops. So you can download the slides. So we'll just take a few minutes now if anybody has any. Okay.
So I'm glad that you use the word poetic as an adjective. I write poetry, I love to write poetry, but the problem is, I have read so many poems by Christians, which are simply prose lined out. And they're utterly unmusical and unimaginative. And they're really bad poetry. And I've also read prose that scintillates with musicality. I think of Robert Farrar Capon and Offering of Uncles. You ever read the book? That book is written in the 60s. That book is more poetic than most poems ever are. I stopped every few pages and said, wow, his writing was brilliant.
Yeah.
In the emotion and the language and stuff.
I would just say, don't be the structure police, right? It's just like we're talking about. don't just look at it and think you know what it is by looking on the page, because I think Richard's right. A lot of the poetry is lackluster, okay? And if you give that to kids, of course they're just gonna toss it behind them, right? We gotta find ways to bring poetry that feels alive, so that when they read it, they feel alive as well. So we can't bring the worst of our poetry and the best of our prose and think that they're gonna choose poetry. Yeah.
I just want to say a comment, which is I think that your enthusiasm for teaching this is incredible. And it is a masterclass in how to be enthusiastic about art, so thank you for who you are.
On this question of musicality, I remember when I was in seminary a long, long time ago, talking about how the musicality of the original language just didn't translate well. Is anybody doing work on that to translate where the musicality of the original language is coming through in the English?
I think that's it.
You
Yep.
mean in the Bible
Yeah.
You mean Bible translation? I'm not an expert on it, but I do think that when I read JPS, the Jewish Publication Society translation of the Old Testament, often that's what they're trying to convey there.
Okay.
But Richard can
It
maybe.
was more than that. Two Jewish scholars, Robert Alter and
Right.
Everett Fox, their translations try to bring up musicality.
Yes. So thank you. I forgot Robert Alter. That would, and it's like 2 years out, right? The whole translation
Even
of
whole
the Tanakh.
Fox has just done their books of Moses.
It's interesting that we get this more from the Jewish perspective than in the Christian perspective.
They live poetry.
Hi.
So I noticed that you gave us context for the lead before we read the poem. And I thought, I wonder what I would have thought of that poem before I read it. And then you were talking about the farmers and how they might, so how do you value context when it's time to do the storytelling? So how do you put that into the equation?
Well, I think, just like, remember that poem I talked about before, the haiku?
Yeah.
The haiku comes out of a tradition called haiku, where you might have a poet like Basho, who was a wanderer of Japan, right? He would stumble around Japan and scribble in his notebook. He was the first travel writer, okay? He was a travel writer, and then when something would just like knock him over, it was too beautiful, he didn't have a camera, so he wrote a haiku. They go together, okay? So it's not like the poem is just gonna descend out of the sky and they're gonna be like, oh, I get it. They won't. They're gonna need you to help them by giving them that context. And that's what I think they need to really unlock the gospel, right? They need the context of how it's still applicable.
I only wanted to add to it, and this is not touching, Heather, on what you asked, but I think it is important to give a context, but it's also important to leave a space for meaning making from the audience. I wanted to share, I put up a picture here from one of the things how we are became more poetic in the church when I was a pastor in Slovakia, is that we incorporated a lot of visual art without explanation. This is, for example, art that we used in the Lenten season, and then also a little bit over Easter. It's a huge piece of broken mirrors tied by this rope, and we resisted explaining it. But it's quite powerful because when you sit in the congregation, you see yourself broken in those mirrors, and you're tied by the rope. So I think also we need to, if it is art, it is not mere illustration, then we do need to be comfortable with meaning making that goes beyond what even we intended with that. And that also goes back to Jesus. It's just quick.
So I have a little story and then a question. So, many years ago, I was here. Hi, Dr. Middleton. And I met this wonderful guy. He was a Christian poet at Christian Poetry, and we did Christian poetry together. And we both were wordsmiths. And eventually in our relationship, he used those same words to heal my spirit, right? And I come to seminary during the divorce. And this wonderful, wonderful brother, so we used to write love poems to each other. And I'm sitting there in class, and this wonderful man comes, and he writes, he has this love poem, and he just puts it on my desk. And the puzzle was broken for me, because I had, even though the gift was inside of me before, and I just loved it. Dr. Middleton talked about Imago Dei, so today is the date of death for my mom, and so then I just know this is God for me being here, like even seeing the poem about my mother. I'm gonna wrap it up. This man brings me this poem, and I'm looking at it, and it's a love poem to me, one of brotherly love. And it unlocked something inside of me because I had separated myself from the gift in the Imago Dei. I could not see the gift that God had given me to write words. And so I'm standing here today to say thank you and to ask you, what was the context? What fell on you to write that to me on that day? Because that's why I'm here today. I saw that you were going to be here. And I wanted to be here to ask you that because I didn't even know what to do. But many years later, I tell people about the story, about the gift of words, and how what was broken up inside of me, you fixed it because it made it that it wasn't a romantic love, but it was the love of God that you showed me. That this man, because I had so many broken relationships with men, but it was my brother that came. So I wanted to ask you about that, like what moves you, what moved you on that day to bless me with your words.
I came to America at 8 months old. I came in paper towel diapers. And so my love of people is deep. And for most of my life in this body, I don't look like the people who I am around. So when I see someone else who I feel is on that edge, I can't help but see them as my brother and my sister. That's how I saw you.
I cannot imagine anything following that. So again, thank you so much for coming to this session, and you also lunch now.